Hey, well, welcome to Conversations on Species Credits. My name is Doug Bruggeman. I'm hosting the series. Thanks for logging back on. I know last time we had some issues with the Zoom, and we switched to WebEx. So hopefully that was easier for you, and appreciate feedback on the process here as we learn how to deliver the content. All right, so I started the series to address successes and barriers in species crediting, and appreciate the interest we received, and we look forward to having a really great group of speakers coming this late summer and fall. However, for June, we ended up with a vacancy, I think, with all the vacations. So I thought I'd jump in and give a presentation in June. We are going to take the month of July off because of the National Mitigation Ecosystem Banking Conference, and we will be holding a table discussion at the conference on Wednesday afternoon. If you'd like to stop by and provide perspective or questions, that'd be great. So I want to thank the steering committee members, Donna Collier, Craig Denisoff, Sarah Young, and Greg DeYoung, with their help in pulling this together as we grow. So, like the other series, I would like to ask that you type your questions in the chat while I'm giving the presentation, and then after I'm done, hopefully maybe a organic discussion will be created, and you can unmute yourself and go from there. So I have about a 30-minute presentation, and then we can hopefully get some discussion going. So I'm going to talk about resource-based compensation, or how do we estimate species credits using habitat equivalence analysis, resource equivalence analysis, and landscape equivalency analysis. So I'm the founder of Ecological Services and Markets, and I've been applying resource-based compensation to species credits for several years now. All right, so what is resource-based compensation? The idea is that, oftentimes ecological resources are injured or removed due to development or some accident. And the idea is that we can keep the public whole with regard to that injury or loss based on the amount of ecological services generated from the resource. So it's compensation based on ecological resources, which means we need to estimate the degree of impact over time on the services times area, and make sure it's equivalent to the benefits of restoration over time times area. So it's a simple concept, and it makes equivalence explicit. It also provides a quantitative framework for looking at no net loss or net benefit. I know some of the past speakers have shown some concern about the use of net benefit in terms of what it means. So I do feel like the resource-based compensation approach fits well within the 2016 Endangered Species Act compensatory mitigation policy. And a few speakers have in the series have highlighted that they felt that this policy should be reinvigorated in the future. So the policy highlights that ecological functions and services at compensatory mitigation sites and impact sites must be science-based, quantifiable, consistent, repeatable, and related to conservation goals. And metrics must account for the duration of the impact, temporal loss to the species, and management risk associated with compensatory mitigation. So really requiring consistent science-based metrics here, but also capturing the time element associated with mitigation. So the resource-based compensation approach grew out of the NOAA program. NOAA's always had a strong group of natural resource economists, and the damage assessment, remediation, and restoration program. Okay, yeah, thanks. It looks like everyone's putting it on mute as they go. Thank you for that. Let me just pause a minute here. Okay. So it grew out of the DART program of NOAA as a service-to-service scaling approach. The idea is to scale the amount of compensation you need to offset damage based on the amount of services provided. And it became known as Habitat Equivalency Analysis. I call it HEA. Some people call it HEA, but I'll call it HEA here today. And it was later picked up with Fish and Wildlife Service on their work on Superfund sites as well. And I'm not sure the extent to which the EPA has been engaging in this, but I'd love to hear that if there's some folks in the EPA here today. All right, so this is the classic application of habitat equivalency analysis where you have some ecological resource here in white that's injured due to some hazardous waste or hazardous impact, causing a loss in ecosystem services per unit habitat. And then there's some recovery that could be natural or restoration based, and you recover it back to baseline levels. And so the equation then is to estimate the change in services over time. So it's baseline levels of services, B here, relative to the injury level of services over time. And it's services per unit habitat, and you multiply it by acres, and you discount those benefits over time. So that's your debit. Your credit is then just the same thing. It's just the increase in services per unit habitat over time at an independent site, at a site of compensatory restoration. So it's the same thing, just proportional change over time times acres and discounted. So I know from doing this work, when I show you these equations, people tend to get a little bit stressed, but hopefully they're fairly approachable. It's just proportional change over time. So habitat equivalency analysis is a more general approach. You can think about any type of ecological service from habitat and apply habitat equivalency analysis. However, it does have some limiting assumptions. It assumes that services scale with acres. And that's how you get discounted service acre years, sorry. And so I had been working as a consultant on NRDAs for a few years, and I kind of became the chief data scientist for HEA kind of by default in the office. So I really enjoyed it, but I thought the ecological assumptions were pretty rough. So I went to grad school and got a fellowship and developed landscape equivalence analysis. And at the same time, a group of economists in California were developing resource equivalency analysis. So resource equivalency analysis focuses on counts of species, counts of individuals, and assumes that services scale with acres, and you get discounted resource acre years. And then in landscape equivalence analysis, the services are any sort of landscape scale service. And I assume that services are affected by multiple spatial dimensions, not just area. And so this allowed me to incorporate habitat fragmentation effects into species crediting frameworks, or in terms of economic lingo, a network externality. So the idea of a network externality came from when we invented phones and started building these phone networks. And they found that as they added more phones and more lines, that the services from the network declined in a nonlinear way. So there was some externality that resulted from the network interactions. So LEA helps us incorporate that. So I dropped the acre component because to incorporate multiple spatial dimensions and have discounted service acre years. So we're including discounting in these metrics. And so we're incorporating the public's preference for benefits more now than later. So basically the public's time preferences for benefits. So I'm sure everyone on the call would rather have that piece of chocolate or that cup of coffee now more than later. So the thing is that ecosystem services will be accruing or being lost at different rates at different times in different locations. And so by discounting, it allows us to get a common present value of that ecosystem services to make comparisons among alternative choices. So basically what you're doing is you're saying that, okay, I would, I'm indifferent to having $1 a year from now or 97 cents now. So if that's my indifference, my discount rate is 3% over that year. And so the value of that $1 a year from now to me is 97 cents. So it puts it into a present value estimation. And so I think this is useful for thinking about the difference between banks or in lieu fees. You know, banks have advanced mitigation, in lieu fees provide mitigation afterwards. So if we were to apply discounting under in lieu fees, you'd have to provide more services per unit area under an in lieu fee model. All right, so habitat equivalence analysis is fairly generic. You can provide or use the habitat suitability indices for your estimate of ecosystem services. You can use species richness, sediment retention. I've even seen the inverse of contaminant concentrations being used in HEA. However, you know, as I mentioned, it has some difficult assumptions in that it assumes that the site of injury does not interact with the site of compensation. And it usually assumes that the sites don't interact with the surrounding landscape. So you're really having independent patches. So here you've got 2 independent patches here. You're assuming no interaction. And this is applying it to a banking situation in which you would have lots of habitat occurring in perpetuity rather quickly over infinity to estimate your debit. And again, it'd be the baseline level of services or abundance of the species minus the take divided by the baseline. That's your proportional change in service. And you discount that service over time and the services per unit area, so you multiply it by acres. And then again, your credit is just your bank minus the baseline. You create a bank, you enhance some habitat, and then move services above some baseline level to infinity, because as bankers, your goal is to provide durable benefits into the future. And so proportional difference over time discounted times acres, and that's your credit. So you have the equivalent measures here for your trait. And so resource equivalence analysis is actually the same thing. The math is the same. It's just focusing on counts of individuals. So now we have like bird years per acre or mollusk years per linear feet or something like that. So the Fish and Wildlife Service highlights that it's best applied to species that don't disperse or assume that the populations exist over a homogeneous area. And they also recommend that you use demographic models to get to that count of species to capture how management affects abundance. So again, the math is the same. And there's lots of ways to extend it and look at it in different angles, but it's basically just, it's algebra. And so getting into demographic models then, hopefully, you know, as you know, within species status assessments or recovery plans, the demographic models are usually derived. We've also put together demographic models outside of these programs just for trading. And we can do it rather quickly within a few months. And so you could do that based on doing a literature review, collecting as much field data as you possibly can, and asking experts. You know, there's a biologist out there who spent 20 to 30 years studying species, and they would really like to have their knowledge reflected in your mitigation. I find that they're amazingly helpful. So once you have a demographic model, you have a testable hypothesis about how management is going to affect the species, which is great for adaptive management. It's also important to state your assumptions as you build these models. And so we use the overview, design, and details protocol derived by Volker Grimm for having a template for describing ecological models, and it basically forces you to state your assumptions. It's very useful. It allows you to contrast your models with other models as you go. So basically what you have then is now you have a demographic model that reflects a species life history traits and habitat quality. And ideally you'd have some hypotheses about how management actions affect demography of the species. And that's input your parameters for your HEA. Those are input parameters for your HEA, RIA, and LEA modeling. And now I'm assuming now we have credits and debits, and I'm assuming that these are happy credits and debits. because now we have one credit metric for all species, and we have equivalent measures for a variety of impacts and restoration actions. So, there's a large variety of demographic models. I'm sure many of you on the call work with demographic models. So this is a Leslie matrix, a fairly common one you might recall from your studies in biology, which is an age-structured matrix population model. So you're estimating the probability of transitioning from age 1 to age 2 based on a density-dependent factor where you have number of individuals divided by carrying capacity. And then you have fecundity as well, the probability of an adult producing young that recruit into age 1 is your fecundity factors. So it allows you to project the population over time. And of course, there's going to be uncertainty, right? There's uncertainty about how life history traits interact with habitat quality. There's uncertainty about survey data, about observational error, and there's uncertainty about how landscape heterogeneity affects dispersal. So oftentimes, this is why details of dispersal are not well incorporated or frankly just ignored in mitigation banking. So I think it's useful to not ignore uncertainty. I think when we ignore uncertainty, it's not good for the species or the private landowners that we're trying to help with liability. So I think embracing uncertainty and incorporating that into decision making would be good for the market and would help reduce our reliance on the Endangered Species Act over time, and we could actually recover species. But it would require us to test expectations over time against data. Okay, so what if we embrace the uncertainty about landscape heterogeneity, right? So how do we do that? Here's a hypothetical fragmented population where you have habitat in gray that's somewhat connected here across the landscape, and the white areas are where habitat has been lost. So we can imagine adding a bank, increasing habitat area, and that's good stuff, right? We love that. And then we can imagine a take where we remove habitat. And so in terms of habitat area, that looks like a really good deal. But you're also affecting habitat occupancy nearby. So you're increasing rates of extinction and drift and other patches across the landscape as we trade. And that's usually ignored because it's difficult. I understand it's difficult. And so it's come to be that a lot of folks use habitat area and connectivity instead, right? These are landscape indices or geometric summaries of habitat and use that as a way to trade credits. And I get that. It's a great approachable way to do it. And I often build landscape indices when I'm building new models for species, just to understand what's going on as a first blush. The problem being, though, that you shouldn't stop there. It'd be great to see people move towards demographics because these landscape indices are not predictive of habitat occupancy in dynamic landscapes. So there's a whole body of literature on this. And this results because the timing of land use change matters. The timing of trades matters. And so we see this in the concept of an extinction debt, or the concept of extinction debt, where you have species existing on the landscape because they live a long time, but the landscape context is not enough for them to reproduce. And so you're not really seeing the future change in extinction that will occur based on just on habitat. So let's think about network externalities. And so we can look at this in more detail using a computer simulation that explicitly incorporates time and space. So it did this for the red-coated woodpecker, using the simulation model for the red-coated woodpecker that's been well published, applying it to fragmented landscape here where you have blue dots are the existing habitat. And we assume that we add a bank here in the middle. And then I simulated a trade within the simulation. And the recovery plan offers some landscape indices based on the dispersal distance of the bird. So I use those landscape indices to make sure I had a one-to-one trade-off for habitat area and connectivity. So I met the goals of the recovery plan with trading, right? And then I looked at the change in probability of occupancy in these patches before and after the trade. So I did that for the bank only. So if you look at the bank only, there's almost no change in habitat occupancy due to trading, right? So it indicates that in spite of trading, the benefits of the bank are very durable, right? We hear that often from bankers, that they provide durable benefits, and that's great. The question is, how durable are the benefits across the landscape? And so then I looked at the change in probability of occupancy outside of the banks in these other patches across the landscape and found that a 50% decline in the probability of occupancy in about 30% of the patches. So that would be a network externality, a decrease in the probability of occupancy due to the change in the network that as far as I know, we usually are not considering. And I would argue because of this, I think bankers are underselling credits. So I developed landscape equivalence analysis to account for these network effects within credits and debits, and to estimate the ability of alternative configuration of patches within the landscape to provide equivalent services. So rather than thinking about individual patches being the resource, now the resource is an entire landscape, and we're comparing the ability of services from different patterns to be equivalent. So in that regard, if two patches traded result in no net change in landscape services, the patches are then landscape equivalent. So in this way, I'm capturing network externalities. And perfect equivalency rarely results, but you capture them in the leftover credits. So in this way, we're linking local economic decisions to regional ecological effects, and we're estimating the extent to which any trade may or not contribute to recovery. And we're rewarding trades that lead to net habitat defragmentation. And we can also integrate population genetics. So I know in most cases, there are no population genetic data for the species that we're managing, but we don't need it to estimate how trading would affect genetics. We can build the simulations and estimate it, just like the model Vortex by Bob Lacey. It's the same kind of approach where you estimate the genetics based on the demographics and behaviors of the species. But if we have genetic data, we can incorporate it for sure. So this allows us to estimate smart credits that prevent trades from moving the spatial allocation of habitat further away from that which the species evolved. So in other words, I'm rewarding trades that move the allocation of habitat closer to the previous condition where drift and migration were balanced, and that minimizes the expression of genetic load. And so we can do this even as the climate is changing. Imagine the climate's changing, the species distribution is moving. So how do you move that species distribution while maintaining the balance between genetic drift and migration? So it allows you to basically prescribe the one migrant per generation criteria as you trade. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that. So the question then is how do we model spatially structured populations? So you can use metapopulation models that are simple extinction probability, extinction colonization probabilities, and those are suitable for butterflies, some amphibians, a limited number of species. And then we can have structured metapopulation models that describe the survival of fecundity, as I just showed you. But we can also incorporate a matrix that has dispersal among patches. So now we're incorporating landscape heterogeneity into dispersal. And we can also do individually based models that are spatially and temporally explicit simulation models. So we're describing the fate and behavior of each individual population. So the great thing about these models is they can capture the transient dynamics of the system. And they've actually been shown to be predictive of habitat occupancy in non-equilibrium landscapes. So when we're building models for crediting systems, we're usually building 2 of the 3 at the same time to figure out what's the most parsimonious way to go. And we're, as I mentioned, we also build landscape indices as well. But it's important to pick the right model. So the model should capture how trading affects jeopardy and recovery. We should state our assumptions and embrace uncertainty, and possibly follow the ODD protocol. And it also provides opportunities for learning as we trade, for following adaptive management. And so if we pick the right model, our data collection is going to be much more cost effective, because as we collect more data, the model is going to improve with data. So it's one comment that Travis Henman mentioned when he spoke in the inaugural presentation in the series was, bankers are collecting a lot of data, but nobody tells them when enough data is enough, right? And so with these methods, I can tell you when enough data is enough. But if you have the wrong model, you'll never have enough data, okay? So it's important to consider these things. And so here's an example of applying a matrix population model to spatially structured population in some software we do for workshops, where we have QGIS out here. We have habitat patches with the species in blue, fragmented across the landscape area in a service area in black. And then we have matrix population models running in the background in R, and including habitat transition matrix to incorporate your habitat management efforts. And we can add different patches. Those patches weren't there. We can add those patches and see how well they contribute to the population growth. Then we can take patches away and determine what would be the debit if we took that patch away. So these are the Lia equations then. We're contrasting abundance, the total metapopulation count, in the bank landscape relative to the baseline, divided by the recovery. So we're estimating the extent to which adding a bank contributes to recovery as our credit. And then our debit then is the extent to which the take it takes away those services. So your credit is this area here, and the debit is this area right here. So we're incorporating the recovery goal into our credits and debits. And then we can look within the results, thinking about source sink dynamics. Maybe some of you guys have thought about source sink dynamics. So a source patch across the landscape, ideally your bank that you create, the durable bank, is going to be a source, right? So your birth rates are greater than your death. And the amount of immigrants away from your patch are greater than the number of critters coming in, your immigrants. So that's a source. And a sink then is you have higher rates of death. You're over here. And the occupancy is actually based on immigration into the patch. That's a sink. So we can look to see, our patches, sources, or sinks within the simulation given the trading. And here we track the bank and the take patch, and we see that we traded a source for a source. That's good. That's why it was a good trade and we had credits left. However, but you can imagine though, in real life, like monitoring births and deaths and dispersal across the landscape would be very, very difficult, right? So that's why we've been using genetic diversity. So network externalities are well captured with genetic diversity. So here's an example of the red-headed woodpecker. You have 2 landscapes that have the same landscape composition in terms they have the same amount of blue and green and red. And the blue is the habitat, the breeding habitat, foraging habitat. And then potential breeding groups then are the census population size here. So similar census population size between the 2 landscapes, but very different effective population sizes. So the effective population size is the size of a genetically ideal population losing genetic diversity at the same rate as the observed population. So this population is losing genetic diversity much slower than this population. So if you're approaching crediting and you're assuming there's a homogeneous dispersal, but your landscape really looks like this, your trading could have negative effects for the species. But if you incorporate it, it actually works out really well. So let's talk about incorporating that into the system. We'll do that with an example with the Gopher tortoise at Fort Benning. So, I mean, so far I've been giving a lot of equations and circles, right? So I want to get into a real world example where we were asked to evaluate crediting situations for the military. And so we did so by building a simulation model first. So I think it's important to do this. So rather than just getting a bunch of stakeholders together and start trading and figure out what would work later, you could build a simulation and figure out what would work within the market first. So that's what we did. So we started out by building a resource selection probability function to estimate habitat for the Gopher tortoise using nationally available data sets. And then we built an individually based model, a simulation model. And so we did so by looking at the literature and then talking to professionals who've studied the species for a long time. And they were amazingly helpful. And that allowed us to incorporate a group of assumptions about how the tortoises disperse and how they determine their home range. So the tortoises establish their home range and maintain it to achieve mating opportunities. So we have a bunch of uncertain parameters within the model. And then we collected as much observed data as possible on the species. And we determined which of these uncertain parameters were best able to fit the observed data, finding the best fitting models. And so we use machine learning to do this. This is technically it's approximate Bayesian computation. And so now we have a subset of models that we can input into landscape equivalency analysis. And so this allows us to learn, I mean, as we go along and get more data and further reduce uncertainty as we go. And so we applied it to Fort Benning that had a partial survey of the Gopher tortoise at the time. So the survey is in this area, with the black dots being the burrows. And then the shaded areas here were areas that were not surveyed. And so we used the spatial autocorrelation analysis of the burrows conditioned on habitat quality to predict burrows in areas not surveyed. And then layered demography on top of that. So we were able to add a couple banks to evaluate a couple of possible banks as well. So they vary greatly in the amounts of acres and habitat quality. So we have two possible banks that are very different. And then we thought, well, let's look at two possible hypothetical removals or takes. We looked at one large take here. And then we looked at multiple small takes around the base. So two possible takes and two possible banks. And each of the possible takes affected the same number of burrows. All right, and then applying habitat equivalency analysis to the simulation. As you can see, the simulation is predicting the decline in the population over time in terms of abundance here. And so our baseline here is in blue, which is covered up by the red, which is the bank simulation. So within the bank simulation, we are simultaneously removing habitat and moving tortoises to the bank. So in this case, the banks had good habitat and we're ready to go. So with that scenario, if we have Leah credits greater than or equal to 0, that's good. That's a good trade. Right, so we see here the blue and the red are very similar, right? So it's suggesting that there's not much impact on the population, which is good. It suggests 0 credits for Leah remaining after the trade. Estimating credits for genetic diversity is more difficult. First, we estimate the historic distribution of genetic diversity to estimate migration drift patterns that minimize genetic load. and then we estimate what that would be in the baseline habitat J, assuming no management. So with that, this quotient is capturing just how fragmented the population is before you begin. And then you subtract from that the amount of genetic diversity in the population after you do the bank scenario, after you move tortoises to the bank. So this is the extent to which banking reverses fragmentation. And so that's your credit. All right, so here we see that the red is with the black here. The red is different from the blue, indicating some erosion in genetic diversity due to banking. Okay, so in terms of results then with the simulation, we see that the best trade differs depending on whether you're prioritizing abundance or genetic diversity. And so our approach to this is, you're going to trade based on credits for abundance, but think about genetic diversity as a cap or fragmentation indices. So we're not recommending trading based on genetic diversity, but still it's important to look at it. And also within the simulation, we test for the significance of the outcome using random permutation testing. So in black here, those were not significant, and so not significantly different from zero. And the red were significantly different from zero, indicating a significant decrease in these cases. So for abundance, the best thing to do would be to do a single large removal and move tortoises to the biggest bank. And then the biggest negative impact was observed with multiple small impacts, and it was observed, and that was observed for the same, regardless of the bank size. There was a large negative impact. So in this case, we're seeing a situation in which the pattern of the take was more important in determining credits than the size of the bank. And this tends to go against a lot of the philosophy of trading. When you do private to private trading, you want to have a big bank, right, and well connected, and that works most of the time when you're doing private to private. However, when you're doing things with public landowners, the landscape context is different, and it's important to consider these dimensions. We also looked at the expected value perfect information. So this is the expected value average across all models here. And then we looked to see if the models disagreed with regard to which is the better trade. And they did. The models disagreed with regard to what could be the better trade. So given the uncertainty that's remaining, you could reduce uncertainty in the future and generate more credits. So there's value to collecting data. So in terms of genetic diversity, we see the best thing to do would be to have multiple small impacts and then move it to the bank. And again, the expected value of perfect information is greater than zero, so we could learn more and generate more credits for genetic diversity. So there are opportunities for trading network externalities. It allows for trade-offs between habitat area and connectivity. It allows for credits for dispersal habitat. And when considering private to private trading, it has lowered mitigation ratios. However, with public to private trading, it has raised mitigation ratios, which has not been popular, frankly. So this also provides a hypothesis-driven approach well suited to adaptive management. And because we're stating our assumptions and we're embracing spatial complexity, it helps build relationships with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So when we first started our work with the military back in 2006, it was driven mostly from the record-educated woodpecker, and they would not. They were talking about trading for the record-educated woodpecker for years, but they could not reach a method. And so I came in and said, hey, what if we embrace uncertainty and look at the spatial complexities? And that's how this started. So I think the Fish and Wildlife Service would like to embrace uncertainties in many cases. And also you can use these landscape scale models to value the market when pricing your credits. So you can build your model and say, hey, what's the value of this market? And also it allows you to predict network externalities, and that could lead to consulting with many landowners. And my feeling is that bankers are likely underselling credits, that there are opportunities to sell credits to other landowners. So just some closing thoughts and hopefully some questions. Equivalence is fundamental to the mitigation industry. So having a quantitative approach to describe equivalence is very helpful. So the preference for advanced mitigation is clear for species, and the HIA, RIA, LIA approaches facilitate quantifying the differences by including discounting. So if you do advanced mitigation, your need to compensate for impacts is smaller rather than delaying. And also I'd argue that ignoring uncertainty is not good. It's not good for private landowners or the species. So if our goal is to achieve sustainability, and I often think as a sustainability professional, my goal is to work myself out of a job. My goal is to achieve sustainability, and so hopefully reduce reliance on the Endangered Species Act. So it'd be helpful if we embrace uncertainty. So crediting programs that value the information are going to be more robust. I remember I spoke to a mitigation banker once, and he was concerned about some new research coming out of some graduate students. And so that just highlights that the mitigation banker, hasn't had the right discussions with the Fish and Wildlife Service about how do we use more information while protecting our investments. And it's a big discussion that we need to have. All right, so with that, I'll be happy to take questions. Let me just find questions. All right, so David is asking, how does underselling credits work? Well, let me go back to this figure. Wait. So in this figure, what I'm highlighting is that we're trading for habitat patches, and there are patches that remain, but the probability of occupancy is decreased because the fragmentation levels have changed due to the trade. So as fragmentation levels change due to the trade, you're affecting the probability of occupancy in other patches. So that's a network effect. And so if you could go to these other landowners and say, hey, we're doing a trade, and it's likely not due to any issue of yours, but there's likely to decrease occupancy of the endangered species, would you like to participate in the market in some way? And so that's the idea. And of course, feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions.
Doug, I have a more fundamental question. This is Dave.
Yep.
So we have endangered species. What are the market mechanisms that require offsetting mitigation? Who's doing that? Which regulator? State regulators, federal? It's got to be federal to start, right?
Well, it can vary quite a bit. I mean, so California and Florida have stronger state programs, and so trading is oftentimes driven out of state programs.
Right.
But more commonly, it's a federal requirement under the Endangered Species Act.
Okay.
Listed species.
Yeah.
Or it can be a candidate species. It's a candidate for listing, and they can develop candidate conservation agreements that incorporate a crediting mechanism. So the state or the federal agencies would be the regulator.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Well, thanks for the question, Dave. If anybody else has any more questions, or you can email me later with questions.
Well, thank you for pulling this together and sharing that information, Doug. You know, it's hard to find information like that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly my pleasure. For me, it's been, many years of work, so I appreciate the opportunity to share it. And there's publications as well behind all this work. So let me know if you have further questions. And I guess with that, we can end early, and we'll see you in Raleigh, the National Mitigation Banking Conference, and hopefully back here in August.
Okay. Thanks,
Thank you so
Doug.
much.
Bye.
Thanks, Doug.